The hallway outside room 14 smelled like lemon disinfectant and old coffee, and Adrian Voss had been standing in it for 11 minutes without moving. He hadn't meant to stay this long. He'd driven 4 hours from Toronto with the intention of signing paperwork, checking that the facility was adequate, and leaving before dinner. That was the plan. That had always been the plan whenever it involved his father. But then he'd heard the singing. It was low, barely above a whisper, the kind of voice you'd miss entirely if the rest of the world weren't so quiet. He'd stopped at the door with his hand on the frame, briefcase still in his grip, and listened without knowing why. The melody was something old. Something he couldn't name but recognized the way you recognize the smell of a place you lived in as a child, not with your brain, but with something underneath it. Through the narrow gap in the door, he could see her. She was seated in the chair beside his father's bed, slightly turned toward the window so the late afternoon light caught the side of her face. She was writing something on a clipboard with one hand and holding his father's hand with the other, and she was still singing, quietly, to no one in particular. Or maybe to him, to the man in the bed who hadn't spoken a coherent sentence in 3 weeks. Adrian's father, Raymond Voss, the man who had built Voss Logistics from a single warehouse in Hamilton into a national freight company, who had shaken hands with premiers and turned down a Senate appointment because he didn't want anyone telling him what to do, was lying there with his eyes closed, breathing slowly, and someone was singing to him like he was a child who needed settling. Adrian told himself it was unprofessional. He told himself he'd bring it up with the director. He didn't move from the doorway. Her name, he learned from the staff board by the nursing station, was Nadia Harlow. She was a PSW, a personal support worker, not a nurse, the distinction apparently meaning she earned less and was thanked less and somehow still showed up every morning. She worked the day shift at Lakeview Continuing Care, a mid-sized facility in Collingwood, that Adrian had selected because it had a 4-star provincial rating and was far enough from Toronto that dropping in unannounced required actual effort. He had not dropped in unannounced in 14 months. He knew this because his assistant Catherine had tracked his last visit in a calendar event titled Raymond, Lakeview, with a small red flag indicating it was overdue for a follow-up. Catherine tracked everything. Adrian had built an empire, a modest one, by Bay Street standards, but real, on the principle that what gets measured gets managed. So yes, 14 months. He wasn't proud of it. He had simply stopped thinking about it in terms of pride or shame and started thinking about it in terms of logistics. Raymond required care. The care cost money. The money was available. The system was functioning. Adrian had satisfied his obligations. That was the story he told himself on the drive up the 400, past Barrie, through the scrubby October hills going brown at the edges. He'd told himself the same story for so many years it had started to feel almost true. Then he'd heard the singing, and something in the story had cracked open. He introduced himself to Nadia Harlow the next morning. He'd booked a room at the inn on the main strip and spent the night reading the facility's quarterly care reports on his laptop, which was a very Adrian Voss thing to do, and he knew it. By 8 a.m. he was back at Lakeview in a wool coat that was too formal for a Tuesday morning in Collingwood, standing outside the staff lounge with a coffee he'd bought from the Tim Hortons 2 blocks over because he didn't know what else to do with his hands. She came around the corner carrying a tote bag and a paper cup of her own, and she almost walked into him. "Sorry," she started. "No, I'm sorry, I was," he stepped back. "I'm Adrian Voss, Raymond Voss's son." Something shifted in her expression. Not the careful neutrality he'd expected. The particular blankness healthcare workers developed around difficult family members, and he understood by now that he was a difficult family member. It was something else. Recognition, maybe, but softer than that. "I know," she said. "He talks about you." Adrian opened his mouth and closed it again. "He has good days," Nadia said, without making it sound like an accusation which somehow made it worse. "Not as many lately, but last month he was pretty clear for a stretch of maybe 4 days, and he talked about you quite a bit." "What did he say?" She looked at him evenly. Nadia Harlow was younger than he'd expected from a distance. Maybe 30, maybe a few years older. It was hard to tell, with dark hair pulled back and the particular quality of stillness that he associated with people who were genuinely comfortable with silence. Most people weren't. Adrian wasn't, though he'd trained himself to perform it. "He said you were like him," she said. "He didn't mean it as a criticism." Adrian looked down at his coffee. "I know he didn't." He stayed 3 days instead of 1. He told Catherine it was the quarterly audit of the facility contract, which was partially true. He told himself it was the drive back to Toronto, which he didn't feel like doing. He was 38 years old and the CEO of a company his father had built, and he was standing in a corridor in Collingwood, Ontario, not going home because he didn't feel like it. The real reason, which he didn't examine too closely, was Nadia. Not in any way that was simple or convenient. It was more that watching her work unsettled him in a way he couldn't categorize and couldn't dismiss. She moved through the ward with a kind of unhurried efficiency, brisk when it mattered, slow when it didn't, calibrated in a way that had nothing to do with anyone watching. He caught himself watching anyway. She bathed his father's hands and rubbed lotion into the skin between his fingers. She tilted his pillows when he shifted and pulled the blanket up without being asked. She talked to him like he was still all the way there. About the weather, about the blue jays nesting in the spruce tree outside his window, about a patient named Harold in room 9 who had complained again about the oatmeal. She laughed at things Raymond almost said. She treated his silence like it was a turn in a conversation. On the second afternoon, Adrian was sitting in the chair by the window when she came in for the evening check. She gave him a small nod and went about her work, and for a few minutes neither of them spoke, which should have been awkward and somehow wasn't. Then Raymond, eyes half open, made a sound, low and uncertain, like he was trying to find his way to words from very far away. Nadia leaned in close. "I'm here, Raymond. Take your time." His father's lips moved. Nothing came out. She didn't hurry him. She just waited, her hand resting over his, and Adrian watched his father's face the way he hadn't watched it in years, really watched it, the terrain of it, the way age had settled into the lines around his eyes, the white of his hair against the pillow. He had not let himself look at his father like this in a very long time, because it required feeling things he had organized his adult life around not feeling. Raymond made the sound again. And then quietly Nadia started to hum. It was the same melody as the day before, old and unplaceable, drifting up like something from the bottom of a lake. She wasn't performing it. She didn't seem aware she was doing it at all. She was just present with him, humming low, one hand still over his, and Raymond Voss's face did something Adrian had not seen it do since he was 7 years old. It softened. The tension went out of his jaw, his breathing steadied. His fingers, which had been curled against the sheets, opened slowly, like a question being let go. Adrian turned toward the window and spent a long moment looking at the spruce tree. He asked her about it later, in the small sitting room at the end of the hall. She was charting on a tablet, and he came in and stood near the window for a moment before she looked up. "The humming," he said. "What song is that?" She thought about it. "It's an old lullaby my grandmother used to sing. French originally. I don't know all the words anymore." A pause. "It just comes out sometimes. I hope that's okay. Some families prefer no music." "No," he said. He stopped, started again. "He responds to it. I can see it." Music gets through in ways that language sometimes doesn't, especially at this stage. She said it simply, matter-of-factly, the way a carpenter might explain how grain runs in wood. It bypasses the parts that are struggling. It finds the older pathways. Adrian sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which he realized after the fact might have been presumptuous. She didn't seem to mind. "Did you train in music therapy?" he asked. "No, I took a few workshops, but mostly I just paid attention." She looked at him steadily. "Your father used to hum to himself when he was doing the crossword. First month he was here, same melody over and over. I picked it up from him." Something moved through Adrian's chest like a current. He set his coffee down carefully. "He did the crossword every Sunday," he said. "When I was a kid, he had this one pen he used, blue ink, and he'd get furious at himself if he had to cross anything out." Nadia smiled. It changed her face completely, opened it up. He mentioned the pen. On the third morning, something happened that Adrian had not prepared for. He came in at 7 before rounds and found his father awake, not half awake, not the drowsy liminal state that passed for wakefulness most days, but genuinely, clearly awake, eyes open, tracking, present. Raymond Voss looked at his son in the doorway and said, with effort but with clarity, "You came." Adrian crossed the room and sat in the chair and said yes, just yes. He didn't explain the 14 months. He didn't launch into the facility report or the financial arrangements or any of the things he might have said to fill the space. He sat in the chair and said yes, and his father looked at him for a long time. "She sings," Raymond said after a while. "I know. Like your mother used to." His father's voice was slow, each word lifted individually. "You don't remember." Adrian was 6 when his mother died. He had, in fact, spent most of his adult life being certain he didn't remember anything from before her death with real fidelity. Only images, fragments, things that might have been real or might have been constructed from photographs. But hearing his father say it, something surfaced. Not a memory exactly, more like the sensation of one. "Tell me," Adrian said. And Raymond talked, haltingly, with long pauses, with words that sometimes came out sideways. But he talked about a woman named Louise who had sung in the kitchen while she cooked, who had a particular song for every mood, who had sung to a small boy in the night when he woke up afraid. He talked about her the way Adrian had never heard him talk about her. Not with the sealed-over silence of grief, but with something that had been kept carefully and was now, finally, being taken out into the light. Adrian sat there and listened for 2 hours. He didn't check his phone once. He found Nadia in the medication room after his father had fallen back asleep. "He talked," Adrian said. She turned from the dispensary cart and looked at him, and he realized from her expression that she understood exactly what he meant, not just that Raymond had spoken, but what the weight of it was. "He's had stretches before," she said carefully. "But this one," she paused, "I think having you here made a difference. I should have been here sooner." He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out flat, stated, not as self-pity but as plain fact, which was somehow worse. Nadia looked at him for a moment. She didn't offer absolution or argue with him, both of which he would have found harder to accept. "You're here now," she said. Simple as that, dry and northern and true. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way he'd been not looking for 3 days, and something shifted in his perception that he suspected was going to be difficult to shift back. He drove to Toronto that afternoon. He had a board meeting Thursday that couldn't be moved and a call with the Rotterdam office at 6 a.m. that also couldn't be moved. And he was, at the end of the day, a person who showed up for the things that could be scheduled in a calendar. But he booked the room at the inn for the following weekend, before he'd even hit the highway. He wasn't sure what that meant. He wasn't sure it had to mean anything yet. He called Catherine and told her to block Saturday and Sunday in Collingwood, recurring until further notice. She didn't ask why. She never asked why. She just said she'd take care of it, which was what Catherine always said, and then she asked if she should flag the Lakeview contract for annual review. "Yes," Adrian said, "and add a line item for staff recognition. Talk to HR about the criteria." "Anything specific you have in mind?" He thought about hands rubbed with lotion between the fingers. A melody passed from a dying man to the woman who sat with him. A clarity that arrived in a room for 2 hours because someone had been patient enough to earn it. Dedication, he said, to the work, not just the hours. Catherine said she'd draft something by morning. He drove south through the October dark, and somewhere past Barrie the radio caught a signal, an oldies station, vague and full of static, and a song came through that he almost recognized but couldn't quite name. He turned it up anyway and drove with the windows slightly cracked, the cold air coming in, thinking about his father's face when it had softened, and about a woman who had learned a lullaby from a man who no longer remembered teaching it. He did not cry. He was his father's son after. But he held the steering wheel loosely, which for Adrian Voss was close enough. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By November he knew the names of the other residents on the unit, knew that the oatmeal situation with Harold in room 9 was genuinely a recurring problem that the kitchen was only partially addressing, knew that the spruce tree outside his father's window had a family of black-capped chickadees, not blue jays. Nadia had corrected herself without embarrassment, which he'd liked. He knew the way the light changed in that hallway between morning and afternoon, the sound the elevator made 2 floors up, the particular quality of quiet on the ward after 8 p.m. He brought his father's old crossword pen on the 3rd visit, found it in a box in the Hamilton house he'd been avoiding clearing out, set it on Raymond's nightstand without saying anything about it. Raymond looked at it for a long time and didn't say anything either. They were alike that way. With Nadia, he found he talked. Not at length, not with the kind of deliberate openness he associated with people who had done a great deal of therapy, but in the honest, sideways Canadian way of people, standing in a parking lot who have 10 more minutes before they have to go. He learned that she'd grown up in Sudbury, that she'd studied music for 2 years at Laurentian before something shifted and she'd ended up in PSW training, that she sent money home every month to her mother, that she had a dog named Gus, who was, by her own description, catastrophically attached to her. He learned that she'd worked in 3 other facilities before Lakeview and had left each one when the culture of the place started making her feel like she was delivering a service instead of caring for a person. "There's a difference," she said once, on the bench outside the main entrance, both of them in their coats, breathing cold air during what he was beginning to think of as the best 15 minutes of his week. Between service and care. Yes, she wrapped both hands around her cup. Service is what you do regardless of who's there. Care is what you adjust because of who's there. She paused. Your father is who's there, not a fall risk file, not an LTC funding category. Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then I used to think of him as a funding category. She looked at him sidelong without judgment. I know, I think most people do eventually. It's how you survive the note being there. A pause, smaller, you're being there now. He looked at the parking lot, the bare November trees at its edge, a crow sitting on a light standard and not doing anything in particular. He asked me last weekend to bring his chess set, Adrian said, from the house. Are you going to? I drove to Hamilton on Thursday and spent 2 hours looking for it. She smiled at the steam rising from her cup. Did you find it? Yes, he hesitated. He beat me in 12 moves. He said you were always impatient, and then he fell asleep. Nadia laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and Adrian felt something happen in the vicinity of his sternum that he was not going to look at directly for a few more weeks yet. Raymond Voss had a bad stretch in December. 3 weeks of low responsiveness, poor appetite, the kind of withdrawal that the palliative care nurse described as the body pulling inward. Adrian drove up every Friday regardless. He sat in the chair. He read to his father from the Hamilton Spectator, sports section first because Raymond had always read the sports section first, then the rest. He did not expect responses. He stopped requiring them. Nadia was there on most of the Fridays, not always. She had her own schedule, her own days off, her own life in which Adrian was, objectively, a minor figure. But when she was there she'd stop in, and sometimes she'd sit for a few minutes, and she'd hum quietly in that way she had, and Raymond's breathing would slow and settle, and Adrian would watch the spruce tree and feel something very old and very tangled beginning, slowly, to loosen. One Friday evening in late December, Nadia found him in the hallway after rounds, looking at nothing in particular. He hummed back today, she said. Just for a moment, while I was getting him settled, he hummed back. Adrian turned to look at her. She was smiling with her whole face, unguarded, lit, the way you look when something genuinely good happens in a week that has otherwise been a grind. And Adrian thought, here is someone who has been doing this work for years in a building where nobody is getting better, where the best outcome is dignity, where the job is to be present for an ending, and she is still capable of being this lit up by a man humming a few bars back at her. He said, before he thought about it, "Would you have dinner with me?" Not a question quite, more like something arriving. Nadia looked at him steadily. There was a pause that was exactly as long as it needed to be. "Friday," she said, "but not here. There's a place on the main strip that does a proper tourtière and doesn't rush you." "Friday," he said. Raymond died on a Tuesday morning in February, with Adrian holding his left hand and Nadia holding his right. It was not dramatic. It was the way most deaths in that ward were, a gradual dimming, a slowing, and then an absence that you only understood fully a few seconds after it happened. Outside the window the spruce tree was deep in snow and the sky was white and featureless, the particular flat white of February in Georgian Bay country that should have been bleak but somehow wasn't. Adrian stayed in the room for a long time after. Nadia stayed too, for a while, and then she left him alone with his father, the way you leave someone alone with something that belongs to them. He sat there in the chair and looked at Raymond Voss's hands, the hands that had loaded freight and signed contracts and moved chess pieces and held a blue pen over Sunday crosswords, and he thought about the distance between Hamilton and Collingwood, which was 4 hours and was also something he'd made the mistake of treating as uncrossable for far too long. He didn't say anything out loud. Raymond would have found it maudlin. But he stayed. He sold the Hamilton house in the spring and kept what mattered, the chess set, a box of photographs, a blue pen that he put in his desk drawer at the office in Toronto, where he could see it from where he sat. His EA Catherine, who had worked for him for 6 years, said she'd noticed he seemed different and then said nothing further, which was exactly right. He drove to Collingwood on weekends when he could. Not every weekend. He was still the person he'd always been. Structured, driven, slightly too attached to his calendar, but he'd started leaving room in the calendar that he hadn't before. Unscheduled time, Catherine called it, and the first time she'd said it he'd almost argued with her. He didn't argue with her anymore. Nadia Harlow still worked the day shift at Lakeview. She still sent money to Sudbury. She still had the catastrophically attached dog. She had by now met Catherine, met 2 of Adrian's board members at a dinner in the city, and met the Hamilton cousin who had always been Raymond's favorite and who cried a lot at the dinner table and whom Nadia handled with the same steady, unhurried patience she brought to everything. In June, sitting on the bench outside the main entrance where he'd sat with her 100 times now in every kind of weather, Adrian asked her what had made her stay at Lakeview, all those other facilities, all those reasons to go. She thought about it honestly, which was what she always did. Raymond, she said, in the first month. He hummed while he did his crossword, and he'd stop and look at me sometimes like he was checking to see if I was actually there, not the aide. Me. She paused. That's the whole job, really, being actually there. Adrian looked at the parking lot, the summer trees, the crow that may or may not have been the same crow on the same light standard. He thought about a man humming to himself over a crossword, about a melody passed from patient to caregiver to the sun who had been 4 hours away and might as well have been on the moon, about the particular way grief and guilt can calcify into logistics if you let them, and about how sometimes it takes someone sitting with a dying man and learning his lullaby to crack them back open. He reached over and took Nadia's hand. She let him. The June light came through the spruce tree in pieces, and somewhere 2 floors up the elevator made its familiar sound, and inside the building people were being cared for, not filed, not processed, not managed, but cared for, and Adrian Voss, who was his father's son and had always been more like him than he'd wanted to admit, finally understood what that was worth. I keep thinking about that crossword pen. Adrian found it in a box in a house he'd been avoiding for years, a blue pen his father had used every Sunday, the one Raymond would get quietly furious at himself over if he had to cross anything out. Adrian put it in his desk drawer at the office in Toronto where he could see it from where he sat. That's not a small thing. That's a man deciding finally to let his father be present in his daily life. A man deciding it wasn't too late to carry something forward. What I find myself sitting with after hearing this story is how much of what Adrian lost wasn't lost at all. It was waiting. His father was still there. The connection was still possible. The distance between Hamilton and Collingwood was 4 hours of highway, and Adrian had treated it like it was uncrossable for 14 months, because grief and guilt, when we don't deal with them, have a way of calcifying into systems, into logistics, into calendar flags and quarterly facility reports. The heart builds workarounds, and after a while the workarounds start to look like the real thing. What broke it open wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a crisis. It was a woman humming a lullaby she'd learned from the man in the bed. That's it. That's the whole thing. Nadia Harlow wasn't trying to fix anyone. She was just paying attention to Raymond, to what he needed, to the melody he hummed to himself over his crossword in that first month. She picked it up from him without ceremony and gave it back to him without fanfare, and that quiet act of genuine care cracked a door open that 14 months of good financial management had kept shut. There's something in that worth sitting with, honestly. Nadia had every reason to do less. She worked long shifts for modest pay in a building where nobody was getting better, where the best outcome is that someone ends with dignity. She'd left 3 other facilities because she could feel the difference between caring for a person and processing a file. That kind of integrity, holding on to your own standards when no one is measuring them, when there's no reward and no audience, that takes something real. It takes a kind of inner toughness that doesn't announce itself. She wasn't performing compassion. She was just doing it in the room every day, whether Raymond's son showed up or not. And Adrian, what he did after that first weekend wasn't glamorous either. He drove 4 hours every Friday. He read the sports section out loud to a man who didn't always respond. He found a chess set. He sat in a chair and stopped requiring anything from the silence. That's not easy for someone who built a career on measuring outcomes. It takes a different kind of intelligence to understand that some things can't be managed. They can only be shown up for. He learned it slowly and imperfectly, which is the only honest way to learn something that matters. I think about the lullaby passing from Raymond to Nadia to the son who had forgotten it existed. That's how the best things move through us, not through grand gestures, but through small, faithful ones. Through someone deciding that the person in the room deserves to be actually seen, through someone else finally walking through the door. What we put into the ordinary moments, the attention, the honesty, the willingness to stay when it's inconvenient, that's what holds. That's what comes back around.